I started babysitting, the parents gave me a horrifying set of rules. I thought I hit the jackpot when a rich family paid me $200 to babysit their child for a night. I never could have guessed this would have led to my life being ruined forever. The children were extremely well behaved and everything went smoothly the first night. The young couple must have thought that I had done a good job because word spread quickly around the rich neighborhood that I was a great babysitter choice. This was perfect for me. Most of the families around here pay way better than where I live since they all come from a long line of wealthy families. But I was always suspicious about some of the families. You hear rumors about really rich people, some very creepy stories, but I never actually believed any of them. Sometimes I'll babysit for a few hours and make a couple $100. Other times the parents want me to stay the night while they go off and get a hotel room so that they could be away from their kids for a change. That is where I make the big bucks. A couple of days ago, a husband and wife had texted me asking if I could stay the night at their mansion and watch their 7-year-old little girl for them. I happily agreed, not knowing this might be the last time I ever see the outside world again. When the day finally came, I drove my beat-up Jeep Wrangler to the edge of the rich neighborhood and made my way up this private driveway that I had never noticed before because the entrance was hidden back amongst the trees that surround the entire north side of town. I drove up this steep, winding driveway for what seemed like 10 minutes before I finally saw the house come into view. Out of all the houses I've babysat at, this was hands down the most gorgeous one I've ever seen. I hoped I would get some good money for this. I got out of my car and made my way up to the front porch, where I knocked on this gigantic wooden door. A few seconds later, a beautiful woman in her mid-30s answered and introduced herself as Mrs. Collins. She called her husband down, and shortly after, an extremely handsome man, also in his 30s, came walking down the grand stairway, holding an adorable little girl in his arms. The couple seemed very anxious to leave, and even though they were both gorgeous people, I could tell that underneath all of their beauty, they were both extremely tired and haggard from having to keep up with their 7-year-old. They were obviously very excited about having an entire night to themselves and couldn't wait to get out of there as fast as they could. Before Mr. and Mrs. Collins left, however, Mrs. Collins handed me several pieces of paper and told me that she had written down a couple of instructions for me to follow throughout the night. She stressed to me how important it was to follow her instructions, and I assured her that I'd give them a look. I waved to the pretty young couple as they made their way down the driveway in their expensive Mercedes, and then closed the door behind me. I gave the instructions a quick once-over before folding the papers and stuffing them into my back pocket. I'll look at them later, I told myself. How stupid I was to do that. Mr. and Mrs. Collins' daughter Samantha was a very nice young girl who warmed up to me almost immediately, or so I thought. We had spent the next few hours playing games and watching TV. After we finished our 5th episode of Teen Titans Go, I noticed that it was getting late and asked Samantha what her bedtime was. She shrugged, not really giving me an answer, which is when I remembered Mrs. Collins' instructions. I pulled out the folded pieces of paper and scanned through them very quickly when I saw the words, "Samantha needs to be in bed before 8 p.m. I checked the time to find that it was almost 7:45. "Well, it looks like your bedtime is right now," I said, lift Samantha up off the couch so I could get her ready. She brushed her teeth and I tucked her into her California king-sized mattress. I told her goodnight and was leaving her room when she said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Don't forget to lock my door before you leave," she said. I stopped walking and turned back around toward her, confused. "What do you mean, don't forget to lock your door?" I asked. "Why would I need to lock your door? What if you have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night?" She looked at me innocently and shrugged her shoulders again. "I don't know, but Mommy always locks my door before I go to sleep. She says she does it to protect me and herself. I don't remember what happens after I fall asleep, but Mommy says that I always try to leave my room at night, which is a bad thing." I looked at her dumbfounded. I didn't know what to say. What sort of parents would lock their child in their room at night? "Mommy told me that she would leave instructions for you to follow, and locking my door is one of them," she said. I had forgotten to read the rules. "Oh, okay, Samantha, I'll lock your door." "Good. Good night, sweetheart," I stammered. She gave me a big smile and rolled over in her bed. I closed her door and noticed that there was a latch drilled into the door frame that would allow someone to lock it from the outside. I closed the latch and then walked back downstairs so I could read the rest of Mrs. Collins' instructions. When I had first seen the pieces of paper, I was under the impression that they were just instructions that told me what shows Samantha is not allowed to watch or how to operate the surround sound. After I started reading them, though, I realized that I was wrong. I was completely and utterly wrong. I started reading, "Hello, Annie. I'm so glad that you agreed to stay the night and babysit Samantha for us. She's such an angel, and I'm sure that the both of you will get along very well. I know that our house might seem old and scary, but don't worry because nothing bad will happen to you as long as you follow some simple instructions. Firstly, Samantha needs to be in bed in her room with the door locked before 8 p.m. Do not open up her bedroom door after 8 p.m. I repeat, do not open Samantha's bedroom door after 8 p.m. She will try to convince you to open the door in many different ways. She will cry, scream, and threaten you until you give in, but do not listen to her. She can't hurt you as long as the door is closed." At this point, I was confused. Why would I leave her locked in there if she was screaming and crying to let her out? Something horribly wrong was going on here, but I continued reading. "Between 8:30 and 9:30 p.m., make sure you remain in the living room with the lights turned on. Around this time of night, you may hear scratching and growling coming from Samantha's room or from other parts of the house. These noises are nothing to worry about as long as you stay in the living room. Watch some TV to pass the time. We have a lot of movies to choose from. After 9:30, do not venture into any dark areas of the house. I would recommend that you turn on as many lights as you can before 9:30 so that you don't accidentally trap yourself. You might also happen to see a pair of yellow cat eyes looking at you through the darkness every once in a while. Do not stare at them for more than 30 seconds. These rules were getting more effed up by the second. I started sweating, my body feeling glued to the floor as I read over the strict but extremely terrifying rules that were put in place. Why had I agreed to take this job? At around 10 p.m., it might begin to sound like there are several people walking around in the basement downstairs. Do not worry, because as long as you stay out of the basement, they cannot get to you. I know it sounds unlikely, but around this time you will begin to feel an overwhelming urge to walk down into the basement. If this happens, go into the kitchen and drink a cold glass of milk. This usually helps. The urge will most likely pass after about 10 minutes, but if the urge is still there after 10 minutes and you don't think that you will be able to stop yourself from walking into the basement, then call either me or Mr. Collins, and we'll tell you what to do. Now this next part is very important. You will be sleeping in our guest room upstairs for the night. Before you go to bed, make sure that you leave a plate outside your bedroom door with a piece of raw steak on it. You can find the raw steak in our refrigerator. And leave a glass of milk next to the plate as well. And that's about it. Final rule, don't eat meat after 8 o'clock. They might see it as a threat and will most likely attack you. P.S. Throughout the night you might hear a dog whimpering from somewhere off inside the house. We don't have a dog, so don't go looking for it. I hadn't realized what I had gotten myself into. Right as I had finished reading the rules, it was 8:31, and the growling noises just started. It sounded like they were coming from every room in the effing house. My hands were shaking as I reread the instructions, the realization of what I was dealing with sinking in. I was trapped in a house with something that was far from normal. The growling noises were getting louder and seemed to be coming from every room. I forced myself to calm down, taking deep breaths. I had to follow the rules no matter how bizarre they were. Over the next few hours, things only got stranger and more terrifying. The growling turned into scratching, and sometimes I would hear what sounded like a soft whimpering, like a dog. But I remembered Mrs. Collins's postscript. They didn't have a dog. I stayed in the living room, keeping the lights on as instructed, and waited. The urge to go down to the basement was strong, but I fought against it, going into the kitchen and gulping down glasses of milk. Around 10 p.m., I heard the sounds of footsteps in the basement, but I didn't go down there. I stayed put, watching TV to distract myself from the cacophony. It was during one of these distractions that I noticed a different piece of paper on the coffee table, a sheet that had been tucked away under a magazine. It was a diet plan for Samantha, written in Mrs. Collins's neat handwriting. My heart skipped a beat as I read through it. It was a weekly meal plan, but it wasn't the usual fare you'd feed a 7-year-old. Liver on Monday, kidneys on Wednesday, heart on Friday. It was a diet composed of human organs. My stomach churned as the horrifying truth hit me. Samantha wasn't just some ordinary child. She was something else. As the realization dawned on me, I heard a loud crash from upstairs. It sounded like a door being broken down. The noise was followed by the soft padding of feet on the staircase. Samantha. I could hear her humming a lullaby as she descended, her voice echoing through the eerily silent house. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood rooted to the spot, my mind racing. I thought back to Mrs. Collins's instructions, her insistence that I follow them exactly. But it was too late for that now. I had made a terrible mistake, and now I was about to pay the price. I could hear Samantha getting closer, her humming growing louder. It was then that I realized the horrifying truth. I wasn't here to babysit Samantha. I was here to feed her. I was the meal. Before you go to bed tonight, there's something that you need to check. It might just save your life. I recall waking up suffocating and drenched in sweat. I was 8 years old, and I had one of those nights where I just couldn't sleep. The room was scorching hot, and I'd spent the whole day inside eating popsicles and watching TV. There was this weird buzzing in my ears, and my whole body felt twitchy, like it was punishing me for spending the day on the couch. Worst of all was my pillow. It had never been this lumpy before. The case had gotten sweaty right away, and then it was immediately wet again after I turned it over. No matter how much I tossed and turned, I just couldn't get comfortable. But this wasn't just because of the summer heat. Finally, I got up and walked past my little sister's room and walked downstairs, where my dad was watching baseball. Seeing me, he muted it and asked if I needed anything. I shrugged. My pillow sucks, that's all. He nodded. Then he got this weird smile and said, maybe it's Mr. Pillow. My dad has always been a goofball. When my mom had left when my sister Madison and I were little, he had stepped up in a big way, loving us double. He was always the one to tell us stupid ghost stories on camping trips about demon-possessed deer or bears who loved the smell of girls' shampoo. And then of course he'd come rattle the tent in the middle of the night and scare us out of our minds. I'm just going to get some water and then head back to bed, I said. I looked over at the TV. The Brewers were losing by like 8 runs, so maybe he was trying to distract himself. He was a real creep, said my dad, ignoring me. Of course he wasn't called the Mr. Pillow back then. I think his name was Douglas something. He loved sneaking into kids' rooms and then strangling them to death. Thanks for that, I said, pouring myself a glass of water. That's definitely going to help me sleep. Of course, they caught him eventually, said my dad. Big trial and everything. But before he ever got convicted, his cellmates suffocated him to death with a pillow. Got it, I said. I turned to the fridge and found some leftover pizza. Then I carefully started picking off the pepperoni as my dad continued. The weird thing came the next night, said my dad. He told me that they found the cellmate dead too, suffocated. Except there'd been no one in the cell to do the deed. Now I know what you're thinking. It was probably the guards, right? Maybe. But then other people started dying. Other prisoners who'd messed up Douglas, all suffocated in their beds. That's when they started calling him Mr. Pillow. Ooh, I scoffed. So spooky. I wasn't believing this for a second. And then kids in the neighborhood near the prison started dying too. He said the moms would come in and find them dead in their beds. The only thing linking the deaths was that some of the kids had mentioned being uncomfortable in their beds the night before, asking if their parents had switched out the pillows. It can happen to anyone. My dad's face was blank. He wasn't blinking. Dad, I said, this is the dumbest thing ever. Just stop. And then in the morning they'd find the kids' old pillows stashed away somewhere, and on the bed there'd be no pillow at all, like it had just disappeared. I didn't even acknowledge that last part. I just hit the bathroom and walked up to bed. Soon enough, I heard the sounds of the baseball game come back on the TV as my dad unmuted it. Then, as I approached my room, I heard footsteps and the creak of a window. I walked inside and looked at my bed. I was missing both of my pillows. The window was open a crack, and I ran over to it. It was dark and rainy outside, and I didn't see anyone out there. Finally, I closed the window, making sure it was locked tight. Dad, I called out. This isn't funny. No response. My heart was beating about 1,000 beats a minute. I walked over to my closet and opened it. Inside, I saw my usual pillow sitting on the floor. I screamed and ran downstairs as fast as I could. Dad! I shouted. There was no one sitting on the couch. The TV was still on, but it wasn't showing the baseball game. It was showing an advertisement. It was for a pillow. It would fold up with a piece of Velcro, and the kids were able to hug the pillow. It was called Mr. Pillow. I was shaking. I didn't know what to do. When the advertisement started to finish, it cut to a distorted, dark room. Children were lying on their Mr. Pillows face down. Each one was covered in blood from head to toe. I backed away from the TV. Sweat was building on my hands. One kid cried out in a blood-curdling scream, and a man in all black walked over to her and pushed her head further down into the pillow. Silence. The TV turned off, and the house went silent. Dad, where are you? No response. There was a ring at the doorbell. I knew I wasn't going to open that, but I simply took a peek through the blinds. It was a Mr. Pillow, lying there on my welcome mat. I ran to the other side of the house. Tears were falling down my face. I ran to my parents' bedroom. Dad, please stop with all this. My dad was lying on his bed, face down. His face was smothered by a Mr. Pillow. I slowly walked up to him, my legs trembling as I took each step. When I touched his face, he let out a deafening scream. His face came up from the blood-stained pillow, and he was missing his nose and one of his eyes. Before I could back away, he grabbed my head and forced it on the pillow. I couldn't breathe. My face was scorching hot. It felt like it was burning off. He was pushing so hard that I couldn't even get a word out. This was how I was going to die, I thought. My own father was going to smother me to death. Then he stopped. I felt a hand lift off the back of my head. When I looked up, my father was gone. When I walked back to the living room, he was sitting there watching the baseball game. I was so confused. Had I just imagined all of this? I couldn't have. I was still recovering from my lack of airflow, and my face still felt hot. My father's head was turned away from me as he motioned his hand for me to come to him. Come sit down, honey. I was skeptical, but I slowly followed. I want to teach you a bit about baseball. You see the batter here? He's swung at 2 balls that are within the square. If he gets the 3rd strike, he goes to sleep. Goes to sleep? I asked. Yes. He won't wake up. The batter was missing a nose and an eye. By the time I had walked up to the couch, I saw my father's face. He still had the same horrifying, deformed face. I backed away. He stood up and I stumbled to my knees. Everyone needs to sleep at some point. You can't stay awake forever. I managed to bring myself to my feet just before he lunged at me. I dove under his legs, and he fell into the wall behind me. I ran up the stairs as I heard his screaming from behind me. Go to sleep! Get to bed! Now! I made my way to my little sister's room, who was supposed to be sleeping soundly at this point. After all the noises in the house, I wouldn't be surprised if she was awake. Once I got in the room, I locked the door behind me. There wasn't any banging, just a silent knock. My father whispered through the door, "Sweet dreams." I couldn't make out anything in my sister's dark room, but I could hear her soft, muffled breathing. She was still asleep. Madison. I followed the direction of the breathing. I made my way to her bed. The breathing sounded muffled. It was sporadic and there was no smooth rhythm to it. I reached my hand out and felt her face. She let out an ear-splitting scream, and her entire body jolted awake. She dug her fingernails into my head and pushed it to the pillow. It was a force that was impossible for a 4-year-old girl. She buried my face in the pillow. It was the same as what my father did to me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. The sharp nails of my sister kept digging into the back of my head. I swung my arms around, trying to grab her and get her off me. No matter where I pushed her, her nails stayed put. They didn't leave my head. The burning sensation came back. I felt my face burning off to a crisp. This was my fate. My baby sister was going to suffocate me to death. My playful, loving, beautiful little sister. My sister let out a whisper, and it sounded like blood was filling her lungs. Go to sleep. I was losing consciousness. No air was getting to my lungs. I couldn't see anything aside from the empty void of what I assumed to be a pillow. Mr. Pillow. The force on my head lightened. I felt my sister's nails leave my skull. The feeling of blood dripping down my scalp subsided. I was able to move again. I lifted my head up from the pillow, but I wasn't in my sister's room anymore. It was no longer dark. I was in my own room. The sun was shining through the blinds. Wind was blowing through the crack of my open window. But my pillows felt different. They weren't soft. They were fuzzy. They were Mr. Pillows. I heard my dad calling for me from downstairs. "Honey, breakfast is ready." Maybe my dad got me new pillows. Maybe this was my gift. Maybe it was all a bad dream. I dreamt all of this. I'm sure of it. "Be down in a sec, Dad." I was in a hurry to rush downstairs. It was Sunday. Dad always makes pancakes on Sunday. I threw on some new clothes and splashed some water on my face. Now it might have been me still waking up or have been in a hurry to run downstairs, but I could have sworn my face looked funny. My nose looked different, and my left eye looked odd. It was a long night. I think I'm going to let my dad know that I don't like the new pillows that he gave me. So do me a favor. Take a look at your pillows. Make sure they're the right ones. Make sure they're not hot, but cold. Make sure they're not fuzzy, but smooth. Make sure your room isn't too hot. Make sure you won't suffocate to death while sleeping. Because if you don't, you're going to have a really, really hard time sleeping tonight. I found my childhood diary. It has entries I never wrote. I lost my diary 2 years ago, but this one has entries from yesterday. I've been packing boxes for the past few days, moving out of my parents' place and into my own. Admittedly, there wasn't a ton to do. I'm trying to furnish a whole apartment with a bedroom's worth of stuff. It's strange how it can seem like you own so many things until you move to a larger space. Suddenly, all of the things that spent years next to each other have a whole new open area to be spread across. There was one box that was nearly forgotten because it wasn't a newly packed box. It was a box packed by my parents years ago. The one almost everyone has, and has to make a decision at some point about whether to keep it. The box of your childhood things. If my dad hadn't remembered, it would have sat up in the attic for another few years. I wonder what we would have thought as kids, peering into the future, knowing that all our favorite things end up collecting dust, and only ever thought about when you move house. I took the box to my new apartment and began sorting through it. I decided to get it out of the way first, as it was the only box where I wasn't sure of the contents. I didn't know how much I'd be keeping, throwing away or donating. Putting everything into 3 piles was difficult and emotional, but I was able to make a decision for most things. To say it opened a gateway back into my childhood would be wrong, as it didn't. A gateway would imply I could walk through and live it again. What it provided was a window, one which I could only look through and never open. But what a beautiful, crystal clear window it provided. Sorting through that box was one of the happiest moments of the past few years, at least until I got to the end. The final item in the box was a diary, my diary. It was pink and shiny, cliché, but all the TV shows had this sort of thing in, so it's what I wanted as a kid. I never stuck to many things in my childhood, and this was no different. I used it for about half a year, and even then I missed about half the days. So even after 6 months, it would have only had about 100 entries. I sat there and read every single one, each dated about 10 years ago, and each one making me happier. But the smile dropped from my face when the dates crossed a threshold of impossibility. 2 years ago. Dear diary, I totally forgot about this. My dad got a new job recently and had to store some of his old work stuff in the attic. I helped and found this whilst up there. Reading through the old entries was enchanting, to say the least. Maybe I'll come back sometimes and write more. Alicia. My handwriting, my name. But I hadn't been up here 2 years ago. My dad didn't get a new job 2 years ago. It didn't make sense. I wasn't exactly scared at that point. I didn't know what to think. I was just confused, and so I read on. 1 year ago. Dear diary, this again. Although I don't remember writing that last year. How strange. It was still cool to read through all of this, though. I've just moved out and found this in a box of old stuff. Good job my dad reminded me about it. I'm hoping that living alone isn't as scary as it seems. I suppose only time will tell. Future me, you got this. Alicia. How could this be dated a year ago? This all happened, but it happened the same day I had read it, and I certainly never wrote it. 6 months ago. I'm not doing this diary BS. What the hell is this? I've never had a diary in my entire life. How does this thing know everything that has happened to me as a kid? At this point, I started to freak out. This entry wasn't like the others. It wasn't just confusing for me, but clearly whoever wrote it was also confused and concerned. Except, they still seem to think they're me. The next one changed that. 4 months ago. How odd. This entire journal perfectly describes my life up until a couple of years ago. I'm moving out in a few months. I haven't already moved out. But all of the entries as a child perfectly mimic my life, except for one crucial detail. My name is Rebecca. How on earth could this be? The next one was the worst. 2 months ago. Dear diary, someone just broke in. I'm hiding in the attic, and I found my childhood diary. I've called the police, but I'm scared. I just need to take my mind away from this. The police wanted me to stay on the phone, but I was afraid of making noise. I can hear them downstairs. I hope I get to read this again soon. Writing this makes me feel like I'm going to be okay. It turns this into a memory, and not a final day. I wish I had time to read the past entries, but I don't. I promise I will soon. I just hope that I manage to. The entry ended there. It's covered in dry blood. At this point, I was physically shaking, but I felt like I had the duty to continue this, and so I did. I took out a pen and wrote, Dear diary, I don't know what this thing is. Will I remember writing this? What kind of power this book has is beyond me, but whatever is going on, I don't like it. I died? I moved out a year ago? My dad got a new job 2 years ago? My name is Rebecca? None of it makes any sense. My pen ran out of ink, so I went looking for another one. I intended to finish the entry, but when I returned, the journal was gone. I got hired at a hotel. On my first day, they gave me a horrifying set of rules. When I first saw the job in a newspaper snippet, I thought it would be life-changing. $300 per hour? Really? What could go wrong? I never could have guessed the horrifying truth about this hotel. When I started the night shift at the Evergreen Hotel, I found a piece of paper waiting for me. Written across the top in Sharpie were the words, "Rules for Employment." "What's this?" I asked Amelia, who was packing up her things. "Just the rules," she said, in an almost suspicious way. "Oh, like don't steal towels and stuff?" She grimaced. "Yeah, just stuff like that," she said nervously, pulling the bag over her shoulder. "Something like that." "See you in the morning," I said with a wave. She grimaced again. "Yeah, of course." Then she muttered under her breath something that weirdly sounded like, "If you're still here." I looked up at her. She walked out the automatic doors and into the parking lot. She had a bit of a jog to her step. "If I'm still here? Of course I'll still be here. My shift doesn't end until 7 a.m. What kind of slacker does she think I am?" Shaking my head, I picked up the list of rules and began to read. If only I'd known what I was getting myself into. I turned to the first page of rules. "You are allowed one free item from the snack bar per shift. Any further items will be charged out of your wages. Do not use the elevator between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. You may see a tall man with a red suitcase standing in the lobby on occasion. Do not make eye contact with him. Just check him into room 231 and send him on his way." I froze. Why was that sentence read in particular? Don't make eye contact? It was a weird rule for a hotel and made me feel slightly uncomfortable, but I shrugged it off as nothing and continued reading the rest of the rules. "If you hear someone crying for help in the pool area after midnight, return to your office and lock the door. Do not leave until sunrise. Do not enter room 404 under any circumstances. If any guests complain that the tap water is black, tar-like, or sticky, call the hotel owner immediately. You must ID every member of the cleaning crew in the morning. If anyone does not come up in the roster, do not let them in." What the hell were these rules? I began to feel like Amelia was playing a prank on me. I continued, "We do not keep any Bibles in guests' rooms. If a guest asks to use a Bible, we keep one in the back office that they can read in the lobby. Occasionally, the computer may show vacancies on the 6th floor. Do not book anyone in these rooms. The Evergreen Hotel only has 5 floors. Do not eat the cookies. They are for guests only." When I interviewed to work at the Evergreen Hotel, they'd seemed like such a mature, stable bunch. Not the type to plan out an elaborate hazing of the new employees, because that's clearly what this was. Amelia, or whoever printed this up, had decided to scare the crap out of new hires. What a cliche. Haunted hotel. I gave a small chuckle, completely oblivious to the horrifying situation I'd gotten myself into. At least now her muttered comment made sense. "If you're still here." How many new hires had they scared off before finding me? Luckily for them, I was a horror movie buff and ex-military. I didn't scare easily. Just in case this prank got out of control though, I saved the hotel owner's number to my cell phone, cursing my dyslexia a few times before I got it right. There were more rules, but I didn't read them. Instead, I walked into the lobby, poured myself a cold cup of coffee, and returned to the front desk. It would be an interesting night. Hours passed and nothing abnormal happened. Until... ding. The bell at the front desk rang. It was a little past 3. I was sitting in the back office, drinking another cup of coffee, playing StarCraft on my laptop. Technically, I was supposed to be going over checkout logs, but I could do that later. Ding, another impatient ring. With a sigh, I heaved myself up from my computer and made my way to the front desk. It was him, the man with the red suitcase. I averted my eyes, focusing on the desk in front of me. I remembered the red text, "Don't make eye contact." Yeah, it was an immature hazing, but that didn't mean I was going to fail at it. I'm competitive by nature, and I was going to ace this thing. From what little I saw, the man seemed to be a tall, thin man dressed in a suit, standing in the corner of the lobby next to the grandfather clock, probably one of Amelia's friends, or that employee Dominic who I'd briefly met earlier. Oh, of course. That's why I'm not allowed to make eye contact. I'd recognize him. I broke into a smile. That's actually really clever. I looked down at my computer, pulling up the check-in screen for room 213. When I looked back up, the man was standing right in front of me. I froze. How'd he get there so fast? I hadn't even heard footsteps. He was just suddenly there. My pulse started to race, but I took a deep breath in, steadying myself. Can I help you?" He didn't reply, save for his fingernails rapping against the front desk. Tap, 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 tap. This is getting really creepy, really fast. I took in a deep, shuddering breath. No, that's what they want me to do. Get scared. They're probably watching all of this right now from the security cameras, laughing their bums off. Tap, 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 tap. I glanced up again. My eyes fell on his suitcase. He'd left in the center of the lobby, and that's when I noticed it wasn't actually a red suitcase. It was white. Based on the metallic smell, I knew exactly what it was. There was so much blood, soaking through the cloth, it appeared red. The substance dripped out onto the floor, welling in a puddle underneath the wheels. Just a stupid prank, I told myself. My eyes snapped back to the computer. I clicked on room 213, fed the new hotel key into the reader. I plucked the key out and slid it across the desk. Without a word, he took the key. I didn't look up until the sound of his suitcase rolling across the linoleum disappeared. When I did, my blood ran cold. The floor was clean. Where the suitcase had stood, where blood had pooled onto the floor in an inky mess, there was only clean wood. What the hell? As I stood there, thoughts racing through my mind, I heard it. the ding of the elevators down the hall, and then, not 60 seconds later, a cacophony of sound. Racing thumps across the ceiling right above me, as if several people were running as fast as they could. The phone began to ring. Calls flooded in from rooms 202, 207, 218. What the hell is going on the second floor? That's when my eyes fell on the list, pushed aside and forgotten on the desk. Just check him into room 231 and send him on his way. Not room 213, room 231. My dyslexia had made me read it wrong. I'd checked him into the wrong room. I was starting to believe this wasn't just a dumb prank. The phone continued ringing, and fear gripped me. I picked up the first call, and a woman's voice shrieked from the other end. "There's someone in here with us. He's standing right outside the bathroom door. Please help." I was paralyzed. What should I do? Should I call the police? Then, a horrifying thought came to mind. The elevators were not to be used between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. It was currently 3:30 a.m. What if the man or whatever he was controlling them? What if the elevators were a trap? Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. I heard a slow, methodical dragging sound coming from the hallway behind me, echoing down the corridor towards the front desk. It was like someone, or something, was dragging a heavy object. I ducked down, trying to hide beneath the desk, praying it wouldn't see me. My breaths were shallow, and my heart raced. The dragging sound came closer and closer, and I could barely hold in my scream. That's when I remembered the rule about not entering room 404. What was in there? Could it be a safe place? A way to escape whatever was happening in the hotel? I grabbed the set of master keys and tiptoed out of the reception, making sure to avoid any line of sight to the elevator and the hallway leading from it. As I reached the 4th floor, I felt an uncanny sense of dread. I approached room 404 slowly, my hand trembling as I put the key in the lock. As I turned the knob and gently pushed the door open, a cold breeze hit me. The room was pitch black, but I had a feeling I wasn't alone. And suddenly, I felt a hot gust of wind. It was coming from directly in front of me. A dim ray of moonlight shined through the curtains. It reflected on a pair of eyes in front of me. A soft whisper, chillingly close, spoke out. "You shouldn't have come here." I've been a deep-sea diver for 12 years. After what I discovered, I'm quitting my job for good. I've seen a lot of upsetting and even unexplainable things in my time, but nothing compares to what I found in my last dive. I don't think I'll ever go near the ocean again. I've considered quitting many times in my career. Most people quit after their first recovery. Being a search and rescue diver, we are trained to find and save people before they drown. Sometimes we save them, sometimes we're just too late, but sometimes what we find is so much worse. I got the call around 11 a.m. A father had taken his 10-year-old son fly fishing. At one point, the father managed to stab a hook all the way through his finger. He went back up to his truck to get a first aid kit. The boy was gone when he returned a few minutes later. When I first heard the story, I hung my head in silence for a moment. It had been raining heavily for almost a month now, and the waters were running faster than ever. To make things worse, it was unusually cold for the season. A number of people had gone missing in recent weeks. Many of them had yet to be found. I had little hope of finding the boy alive. Me and a couple of other divers were at the site where the boy went missing within an hour, and a larger search and rescue team located a few towns over was headed our way. We talked with the father and even searched the forest for a bit, hoping that he had just wandered off, but eventually we realized that we would have to begin searching in the river. It wasn't a new feat for us to have to dive in somewhere other than the ocean. People frequently go missing in waterways that connect to the ocean. The moment I got in the water, I knew the boy was gone. The current was worse than it had ever been, and even I had difficulty navigating the icy river. We looked for hours in the surrounding areas and even expanded our search once the larger team had arrived. The boy was nowhere to be found. I was surprised. I hadn't expected to find him alive, but I had at least anticipated finding a body. However, there was no trace of him. The sun got low and the air grew colder. We were considering calling it off as nightfall approached and resuming the search the next day when I discovered something. There's a lot of creek beds around the river. Many of them have dried up as a result of encroaching vegetation or man-made efforts to divert the water. We usually don't pay any attention to them. However, with all of the recent rain, I noticed that one of the larger creek beds had begun flowing again. A surprising amount of water crashed through it, easily enough to carry a young boy. The creek ran directly across a bend in the river, connecting it at 2 points. I followed it and realized that the boy could be located outside of our initial search area. As I approached where the creek reconnected with the main river, I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. There's a place in the river where not even search and rescue divers are supposed to go. It's known as Badwater. This area lies on one half of the river and runs for about 100 yards. It's near a densely vegetated area, so we don't often have to worry about people swimming there. But a lot of disappearances occur in the surrounding waters. Despite that, I've been warned not to dive there since I began doing search and rescue. Supposedly the undercurrent is so strong that even the most experienced swimmer would be swept away in an instant. Don't go near Badwater. It was a mantra of the older divers. The creek ended exactly in the center of the Badwater region. As I reached it, I stopped and chewed my lip thoughtfully. If I went back and reported this to the other divers, they would tell me to let it go. They wouldn't let me dive there. But deep down, I felt like the boy's body must be tangled up in some weeds nearby. If only I could find it. I hated the idea of that kid being stuck down there, slowly bloating and rotting away while his parents sat at home wondering where their boy had gone. Badwater didn't seem to be that bad. I'd seen rougher waters before, but I knew looks could be deceiving. Just below the surface it could be flowing faster than I ever imagined, and I'd be swept away in an instant. Besides, I wasn't supposed to dive alone. I almost turned back, but something made me stay. I stared into the river for a moment, thinking about the boy. Then I put on my gear and dropped into the icy waters. The first thing I noticed was that the current actually seemed pretty weak. As a matter of fact, it was weaker than the rest of the river. The water was extremely deep there, and I could see only blackness below as I dove. I kicked deeper and deeper, thinking that the current might pick up lower down, but the opposite seemed to be true. The water was almost completely still. I went even deeper, until finally green shapes began to materialize in front of me. I thought I'd finally reached a bed of weeds, but as I kicked lower, the truth came into full view. I felt vomit come up at the sight, an odd and dangerous sensation when you're wearing a scuba mask. Countless arms stuck up from the ground below. I thought I had come upon a trove of bodies, but the disgusting reality became even more apparent only a moment later. The arms grew directly into the ground. They even had roots that spread out from the base. It was as if someone had cut off hundreds of arms at the shoulder and planted them there. They were green, and I watched as they clutched at the water around them. They varied in size and seemingly age. Grotesque baby hands sprouted near the bottom, and they opened and closed their fists hungrily. It was then that I saw the boy. His eyes stared sightlessly ahead as those grotesque arms pulled his dead body downward. It seemed they had just gotten a hold of him. The arms yanked at him, burying him in the surrounding sediment. They pushed and writhed and squirmed until he was securely buried up to the chest. I stared in mesmerized horror. That was when the other bodies came into focus. There must have been at least 4 more, all in varying stages of decay. Some were bloated beyond recognition, only bulky white masses that protruded loosely from the riverbed. I once again felt vomit rising in my throat and swallowed it back down. The hands were feeding off the bodies, using them as fertilizer. The moment I clambered out of the water, I tore my mask off and retched. I couldn't stop thinking about those disgusting bodies, those grasping hands. They were like some sort of carnivorous plant, yet they were so humanoid. I vomited again at the thought. I frantically ran back to our base camp and pulled one of the other divers aside. Moose was the most experienced person on our team. He'd been diving for over 20 years ever since moving here. I told him about what I saw. When I finished, he stared at me in cold silence. I told you never to go near Badwater. His voice contained an iciness that even his thick Louisiana accent couldn't conceal. That's what you're concerned about? I was incredulous. He placed a hand on my shoulder and squeezed tightly. Don't tell anyone else about this. If the others find out you went into Badwater. He trailed off and thought for a moment. Well, it won't be good. He shook his head like a disappointed father. But what about those things? I tried to keep my voice down, hoping no one would hear us. How many people have died because of those damn things? Shut up, Moose said. We have an agreement. There's a reason they only grow in Badwater. Don't mess this up. I started to say something, but the words caught in my throat. He was keeping something from me. He sighed, and I saw something like sadness behind his eyes. Sometimes you have to decide between lesser and greater evils. Even the best possible decisions can still keep you up at night. He went silent for a moment and only stared at me. Don't tell anyone about this. Maybe one day you'll understand. He walked away after that and called off the day's search. Despite what I told him, we continued to search for the next 2 days. By the 3rd day, we called it off completely and gave our condolences to the family. The search was called off, but I couldn't let it go. That night, I went back to Badwater alone. I took my equipment and drove over there. I had to see those horrible plant-like arms again. I had to know they were real. As soon as I got there, I threw on my scuba gear and dove into the darkness. I dove into the icy blackness, kicking deeper and deeper. I swam past the typical small fish or seagrass until I reached the riverbed. But this time, there was nothing. No grasping green arms, no buried bodies, just empty mud and darkness. Was I in the wrong spot? No, I was sure of it. I surfaced, gasping for air. As I swam for shore, I felt something brush my leg. I jerked away, heart pounding, and turned to look. Nothing. It must have been the seagrass. Then I felt a sharp set of claws dig into my leg. I screamed out in pain, muffled by the cover on my face. I kicked and tried to swing at the claws, but it was no use. They were digging deeper into my skin. A pale arm reached up from the depths below, its long, skinny fingers brushing my flipper. I felt another set snatch onto my forearm. It was taking my arm. I screamed and swam faster, and the claws fell out of my skin. I finally stumbling onto the shore. There were rips in my wetsuit. Blood was seeping from my skin. What the hell was that? I turned back to the water, shaking. The river was calm and still, no sign of the nightmarish arm. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? Just as I stood to leave, I heard Moose's voice behind me, cold as ice.